You closed the door too fast. You didn't even see what you were rejecting. The words were calm, almost gentle, but they landed hard enough to make the man in the tailored suit pause with his hand still on the glass handle as the revolving doors of Synexus Tower slowed behind him, sunlight spilling across polished marble floors and reflecting off chrome columns like something out of a magazine, and standing just outside that perfect world was Nia Brooks, 24 years old, 5'6", shoulders straight despite the weight of every no she had ever heard, her dark curls pulled back loosely, her coat worn but clean, and in her hands a thin leather folder pressed tight against her chest like it held more than paper, like it held proof she was tired of begging to be seen. And inside the lobby, Ethan Caldwell, Billionaire founder and the kind of man who never repeated himself, turned halfway, his blue eyes narrowing not with annoyance, but with something sharper, curiosity that didn't come often and never by accident, because something in her voice hadn't sounded desperate, it had sounded certain, and certainty from someone like her didn't fit the pattern he trusted. So he studied her the way he studied markets before tearing them apart, quiet, calculating, waiting for the flaw, but she didn't move, didn't rush to explain, didn't apologize. She just held his gaze like she had already done the math and knew exactly where this moment would land. And somewhere behind her through the glass, a digital screen flickered, numbers stuttering for half a second, before snapping back into place, so subtle no one inside noticed except him, because Ethan noticed everything, and his fingers loosened on the handle as he stepped back out into the chill of the street, the city noise wrapping around them, taxis passing, horns echoing, life moving on like this moment didn't matter, but it did, because now he was standing face to face with the one thing he couldn't categorize. "What did you just do?" he asked, voice low, controlled, but no longer dismissive, and Nia tilted her head slightly, as if the question itself was the wrong one. "I didn't do anything," she said softly. "I corrected something that was already wrong." And that answer should have ended it, should have made him walk away, because arrogance was something he had no patience for, especially from someone with no credentials, no backing, no invitation, but something in the way she said it, not proud, not defensive, just factual, made the air shift between them. So instead of leaving, Ethan exhaled slowly and glanced back at the screen, then at her again, weighing risk the way he always did. Except this time the equation wasn't numbers, it was her. "All right," he said finally, stepping aside just enough to open the door a second time, but not wide, never fully welcoming. One question, and inside, a few heads turned, assistants whispering, security hesitating, because people like her didn't get second chances here, not without reason. And as she stepped forward, the marble reflecting her worn shoes, the entire room seemed to quiet without knowing why. Ethan gestured toward a console, lines of code frozen mid-process, a problem that had cost him days, millions, and the patience of the best engineers money could buy. "Fix that," he said, not offering her a seat, not offering her respect, just a challenge wrapped in expectation of failure, because that's how tests worked in his world. And for a second, just one, Nia didn't touch the keyboard, her eyes scanning the screen, absorbing, calculating, not rushing. And then she smiled, not wide, not warm, just enough to make something in his chest tighten unexpectedly. "This isn't broken," she said, placing her fingers gently on the keys. "It's hiding." And before anyone could question what that meant, she moved, not fast, not dramatic, just precise, rewriting a line, then another, her reflection merging with the glass as the system responded instantly, numbers stabilizing, projections realigning, the entire structure correcting itself like it had been waiting for her to notice. And in the silence that followed, where even the hum of the building seemed to hold its breath, Ethan Caldwell realized something he hadn't felt in years. Not control, not certainty, but something far more dangerous, the first flicker of being wrong. And as he looked at her again, really looked this time, he understood this wasn't a coincidence, and whatever she had just revealed, it was only the beginning. The room did not applaud, it recalibrated, and that was worse because silence inside Synexus Tower did not mean approval, it meant evaluation, and right now, Every set of eyes that mattered had shifted toward Nia Brooks, like she had just rewritten more than code, like she had disturbed something that preferred to stay controlled. Ethan Caldwell did not speak immediately. He walked past her slowly, hands in his pockets, gaze locked on the stabilized screen, as if expecting it to fail again, as if the system itself should reject what had just happened, but it did not. It held steady, precise, clean, almost elegant, and that bothered him more than any glitch ever could, because elegance was intentional, and intention required ownership. So he stopped just a few feet away and said without turning, "Explain it." His tone was calm, but the weight behind it filled the room like pressure before a storm. Nia did not step back. She did not rush. She simply closed the console panel with a soft click and met his reflection in the glass. "You built something that learns," she said quietly, "but you trained it to listen to the wrong signals." A murmur moved through the engineers nearby, subtle but sharp, defensive instinct dressed as disbelief. Ethan finally turned, now fully facing her. "That system was designed by a team of people with decades of experience," he said, and there was no arrogance in his voice, just a statement of fact, the kind that usually ended conversations like this. But Nia tilted her head slightly again, the same way she had outside, like she was looking at the flaw, not the authority. "Experience teaches patterns," she replied, "but it also locks you inside them." That landed differently, not as defiance, but as something more dangerous, clarity. And for a second no one spoke, because no one wanted to be the first to challenge it. Then a voice cut in sharp from the left. "Who even let her touch that console?" A senior engineer stepped forward, tall, mid-50s, badge gleaming, confidence worn like armor. "We do not let unverified candidates interfere with active systems." His eyes flicked to Ethan, expecting correction, expecting dismissal, expecting the balance to restore itself. But Ethan did not look at him. He kept his focus on Nia, because something in his instinct refused to close this door yet. "What is your name?" he asked finally, and she answered without hesitation, "Nia Brooks." No resume, no explanation, just the name, and somehow that felt intentional, like anything more would have been unnecessary. Ethan nodded once, then gestured lightly toward the hallway. "Walk with me." It was not an invitation, it was a shift, and everyone in that room felt it, the hierarchy bending just slightly as he turned and moved, without waiting to see if she followed. But she did, her steps measured, not fast, not hesitant, just aligned with his pace, as they moved past glass offices and silent assistants until the noise of the main floor faded into a quieter corridor lined with framed patents and headlines, evidence of a man who had never needed to second-guess himself until now. "You do not have a profile in our system," he said as they walked, his voice lower, now more private. "No academic record, no prior employment, no published work, and yet you corrected a core function in under 30 seconds. He paused, stopping near a window overlooking the city skyline, sunlight cutting across his face. "So either you are extremely lucky, or you have been hiding." Nia looked out over the traffic below, hands relaxed at her sides. "Luck does not scale," she said softly, and that answer settled between them heavier than anything else, because it removed the easiest explanation. Ethan studied her again, not her clothes, not her posture, but the stillness, the control, the absence of performance, and for the first time, he felt something unfamiliar, not doubt in her, but doubt in his own assumptions. "Why come here today?" he asked, and this time there was no challenge in it, just a need to understand. And Nia finally looked directly at him, her eyes steady, grounded, like she had already asked herself that question long before he ever would. "Because this is where the mistake started," she said, and in that moment the distance between them did not close, it shifted, and Ethan Caldwell realized he was no longer evaluating a candidate. He was standing in front of a variable he had never accounted for, and somewhere deep in the system behind them something began to flicker again, not failing, not breaking, but changing, as if it recognized her presence and was waiting for what she would do next. "Then show me the mistake," Ethan said. And this time his voice carried something new, not authority, not challenge, but permission, and that was the shift. Nia Brooks did not hesitate. She turned before he could say anything else and walked back toward the main floor, her pace steady, like she already knew exactly where she was going. And for the first time Ethan followed without leading. When they stepped back into the open workspace, the energy had changed, conversations had slowed, screens were being watched more closely, as if the building itself had become aware of her presence. The same senior engineer from before crossed his arms the moment they approached, his expression tight, controlled. "This is not appropriate," he said clearly, not lowering his voice. "We have protocols for a reason." But Ethan did not respond immediately. He simply looked at the central system display, then at Nia, and gave a small nod that was all it took. She stepped forward again, placing her hand near the console, but not touching it yet, her eyes scanning the data flowing across the screen faster, now more complex than before, like the system had woken up and was reacting. "It is adapting again," she said softly, almost to herself, and that single sentence pulled every technician closer, because that should not have been possible, not this quickly, not without input. Ethan narrowed his gaze. "Adapting to what?" he asked, and Nia finally touched the console, her fingers light, precise, as she navigated through layers of code no one else seemed to recognize as easily as she did. "To me," she answered, and the words did not sound like pride, they sounded like observation, like she was describing gravity or time, something inevitable. The engineer scoffed under his breath. "Systems do not adapt to individuals, they follow input patterns." But Nia did not look at him. She kept her focus on the interface. "Only if you designed them to ignore anomalies," she replied calmly. "You taught it to smooth out what it could not understand, so it hides instability instead of learning from it." Her fingers moved again, opening a deeper layer, one that made even the senior staff lean forward slightly, because it was not supposed to be accessible from this level. Ethan stepped closer, now just behind her shoulder, watching closely, not interrupting, and then the screen shifted. Not a glitch, not an error, but a reveal. Hidden data streams began to surface, patterns within patterns, loops that had been quietly correcting themselves without anyone noticing. "You see stability," Nia continued, her voice steady as the room grew quieter. "But what you actually have is suppression." A ripple of discomfort moved through the team, because that word changed everything. Suppression meant something had been missed, something had been ignored, and in a system built on precision, that was unacceptable. Ethan felt it immediately, not panic, not fear, but recognition, the kind that comes when a truth fits too perfectly to deny. "If that is true," he said slowly, "then what happens when it can no longer suppress it?" Nia did not answer right away. Instead, she executed one more command and stepped back slightly, just enough for him to see the result clearly. The projections shifted again, this time not stabilizing but recalculating in a new direction, faster, sharper, more aggressive. And then for a brief second the system paused, not failing, not breaking, but thinking, and in that silence, something changed. The numbers aligned into a pattern none of them had seen before, a trajectory that bypassed their current model entirely, opening a path that should not have existed. "It evolves," Nia said finally, and when she turned to face him again, there was no triumph in her expression, only certainty. "But only if you stop controlling it long enough to let it become something else." The engineer shook his head immediately. "That is not how controlled systems operate." But Ethan did not look at him. He was still watching the screen, the new path, the unexpected outcome, the possibility that everything he had built was only a fraction of what it could be. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, he smiled, not because he was pleased, but because he understood something now that he had not before. This was not about fixing a system, this was about redefining it. And as he shifted his gaze back to Nia Brooks, he realized something even more unsettling. She was not discovering the system. She was remembering it, and whatever she had not said yet, whatever she was still holding back, that was where the real answer lived. And he was no longer sure he was ready for it. "Say it," Ethan said quietly, his voice cutting through the charged silence like a line drawn in stone. And this time there was no distance left between them, only expectation, because whatever Nia Brooks had not said yet had already begun to reshape the room, and he needed to hear it out loud. Nia held his gaze for a moment longer, then turned back to the screen, not to avoid him, but to anchor the truth in something visible, something undeniable. Her fingers hovered above the console again, but did not touch it. "You did not design this system to evolve," she said calmly. "You designed it to obey." And that distinction landed heavier than anything before, because obedience was predictable, safe, controllable, but evolution was not, and the engineers around them shifted subtly, their confidence no longer as solid as it had been minutes ago. The senior engineer stepped forward again, unable to stay silent. "We built safeguards for a reason," he insisted. "Uncontrolled systems introduce risk." Nia nodded slightly, as if acknowledging the logic without agreeing with it. "Control introduces blindness," she replied. "You stop seeing what the system is trying to become because you are too focused on what it used to be." Ethan watched her closely, every word, every pause, every shift in tone, and something inside him recognized the pattern, not in her explanation, but in her certainty. This was not theory to her, this was memory, and that realization changed the weight of everything he was about to ask. "What are you not telling me?" he said finally, his voice lower. Now more direct, and for the first time since she walked into the building, Nia did not answer immediately. The room seemed to hold itself still as she exhaled slowly, then reached into her leather folder, pulling out a single sheet, not thick, not impressive, just plain paper worn slightly at the edges like it had been carried for a long time. She placed it gently on the console and stepped back just enough for him to see it clearly. Ethan leaned forward, his eyes scanning the page, and for a second nothing made sense until it did. Lines of architecture, flow patterns, structural decisions, the earliest version of the system, not the one they use now, but the foundation beneath it, the blueprint that everything else had been built on. His expression did not change immediately, but something behind his eyes did, something quiet and precise. As recognition began to settle, he stopped himself because finishing that sentence would mean admitting something he had never considered possible. Nia finished it for him. The original model, she said simply, and the room reacted before he could. Whispers, rising, confusion turning into disbelief, because that document was not public, it was not shared, it was something that existed only in the earliest internal archives, something even most senior engineers had never seen. Ethan straightened slowly, his attention no longer divided, no longer calculating. He was fully present now. "How do you have this?" he asked, and the question was not defensive, it was careful, because the answer mattered more than the proof itself. Nia met his eyes again, and this time there was no distance, no deflection, no restraint. "Because I wrote it," she said, and the silence that followed was absolute. No movement, no sound, just the weight of a truth that did not fit the world they thought they understood. The senior engineer shook his head, immediately stepping back as if distance could correct it. "That is not possible," he said, but his voice lacked conviction now because the evidence was right there in front of him. Ethan did not speak. He simply looked back at the paper, then at the system, then at her, and the connection locked into place. Every correction she had made, every instinct, every line of code, she had touched it, all aligned not as coincidence, but as authorship. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, he let out a breath he did not realize he had been holding. "You built this," he said, not as a question but as confirmation, and Nia gave the smallest nod, not proud, not hesitant, just true. "Not this version," she clarified softly, "the part you buried underneath it." And that was the moment everything shifted, not just in the room but inside him, because if she was right, then everything he had been leading, everything he believed he controlled, was built on something he did not fully understand. And as he looked at her again, this time without assumption, without hierarchy, he realized something far more unsettling than being wrong. He realized he had been building on someone else's vision all along, and he had no idea what she was about to take back. No one moved for a full 3 seconds, and in a room built for constant motion, that silence felt unnatural, like the system itself had paused to process what had just been said. Ethan Caldwell did not look at anyone else. He did not need confirmation. He had already seen enough to understand that this was no bluff, no misunderstanding, no coincidence. The patterns lined up too cleanly, the architecture too precise, the corrections too intuitive. This was authorship standing in front of him, and it changed everything. Slowly, he reached for the paper again, his fingers brushing the edge, as if testing whether it was real. "Why was it buried?" he asked finally, his voice no longer carrying authority, but something deeper, something more careful, because the answer would not just explain the past, it would redefine his present. Nia Brooks did not rush to respond. She watched him for a moment, measuring not his words, but his readiness. Then she stepped closer to the console again, her reflection aligning with the glass like it belonged there because it did not follow the rules they wanted. She said quietly, and that word they landed heavier than expected because it introduced something outside of Ethan's control, something beyond his decisions, his company, his structure. The senior engineer frowned immediately. "That is not how this company operates," he said firmly. "We innovate within defined parameters." Nia glanced at him briefly, not dismissive, just uninterested in defending something that was not her focus. "Defined parameters are just boundaries. Someone else decided we're safe," she replied, "and safe does not always mean right." Ethan exhaled slowly, his mind already moving ahead, connecting timelines, reconstructing decisions he had not personally made because in the early days Synexus had grown fast, too fast for him to oversee every detail. There had been acquisitions, partnerships, integrations, layers built on top of layers, and somewhere in that expansion, something original, something foundational, had been altered. "Who removed it?" he asked. His gaze sharp again, not at her, but through the problem, and this time Nia did not answer with certainty, she answered with intention. "You did not remove it," she said instead, "but you allowed the people who feared it to reshape it." That answer did not accuse him directly, but it did something worse. It implicated him in a system that had quietly drifted away from its origin, and Ethan felt that weight settle in his chest, not as guilt, but as awareness, the kind that demands action. The engineer shook his head again, but slower now, less confident. Even if that were true, there would be records, documentation, something that proves authorship. Nia nodded slightly, as if she had expected that. There is, she said simply, and without hesitation she reached back into her folder, pulling out a small flash drive, no branding, no label, just a simple piece of metal, and placed it on the console beside the paper. This contains the original training logs, early iterations, and the decision tree before it was rewritten. The room leaned in again, tension rebuilding, because proof changes everything. Ethan looked at the drive, then at her, and for the first time since this began, there was a question in his expression, not doubt, but curiosity about her, not just what she knew, but why she had waited until now. Why bring this here today? He asked, and the answer came without pause. Because it is starting to break again, she said, and that shifted the air instantly, because this was no longer about the past. It was about something happening now, something urgent, something real. Ethan's eyes moved back to the system display, where the stabilized projections still held, but now he saw them differently, not as success, but as pressure being contained. Show me, he said, and this time there was no hesitation, no hierarchy, just alignment. Nia turned back to the console, inserting the drive with a quiet click, and within seconds the screen began to change, layers unfolding, data streams reconnecting to their original structure, patterns emerging that had been hidden for years. And then it happened, not a failure, not a crash, but a deviation, a subtle shift in trajectory that no one else had predicted. The system was no longer following the model, it was choosing a new one, and in that moment Ethan understood something that unsettled him more than anything before. The system was not just evolving, it was remembering, and as he looked at Nia Brooks standing calm in front of it, he realized the truth was no longer something he could control, it was something he had to decide whether to follow. Do not stop it, Nia said quietly, and the urgency in her voice was different this time, not fear, not panic, but precision, like she was guiding something fragile through a narrow space. Ethan's hand froze midair, just inches from the override panel, where years of instinct had taught him to regain control at the first sign of deviation, but now control felt like interference, and interference felt like loss. He lowered his hand slowly, eyes locked on the system, as the data continued to unfold, not chaotically, not dangerously, but deliberately, as if it was following a path no one had given it permission to take. The engineers around them shifted uneasily, fingers hovering over their own stations, waiting for an order that did not come. This is outside acceptable thresholds, the senior engineer said, his voice tight with restraint. We need to contain it before it diverges further. But Ethan did not answer him. His attention remained fixed on the evolving projections, patterns, branching outward, connections forming between datasets that had never been linked before, efficiencies emerging in real time, not programmed, not predicted. Discovered, and for the first time since he built Synexus, he was watching something inside his own system that he did not fully understand, and that realization should have terrified him, but instead it did something else. It held him still. It is not diverging, Nia said softly, stepping closer to the console, her eyes tracking the movement like she was listening to a language no one else could hear. It is resolving. That word settled into the room differently. Resolving meant there was a problem deeper than what they had seen, something foundational, something structural, and the system was not breaking under pressure, it was correcting itself around it. Ethan's voice came lower, now quieter than before. What is it? Resolving. And Nia paused for just a second, then answered in a tone that carried no hesitation. The part you forced it to forget. And that was when the next shift happened. The screen flickered, once not unstable, not erratic, but intentional, as if something had just been unlocked, and then the projections changed again, not gradually this time, but completely. The previous models dissolved, replaced by a new framework, one that moved faster, cleaner, more adaptive than anything Synexus had ever produced. And the room reacted, not with noise but with stillness, because they were no longer watching a system, they were witnessing a transformation. The senior engineer stepped forward again, but slower now, his certainty fractured. This cannot be verified, he said, but even as he spoke his eyes remained fixed on the screen, unable to look away, because what he was seeing contradicted everything he believed about controlled systems. Ethan finally exhaled a long, measured breath, then turned slightly toward Nia. Not fully, just enough to bring her into focus beside him. If I let this continue, he said carefully, what happens next? And this time the question was not about risk, it was about trust. Nia met his gaze, steady, grounded, unshaken. It becomes what it was meant to be, she said, and there was something in that answer that reached past the system, past the code, past the moment itself, because it was not just about technology, it was about intention, about design, about something that had been constrained and was now pushing back into its original shape. Ethan looked back at the screen, watching as the system continued to evolve without instruction, without correction, without permission, and he understood something then that no report, no projection, no analysis could have shown him. This was not a malfunction, this was a return. And as the new model stabilized into something entirely unfamiliar, yet undeniably powerful, he realized the real decision was no longer whether to stop it. The real decision was whether he was willing to let go of everything he thought he had built in order to see what she had already created. It is not finished yet, Nia said, and the words carried a quiet certainty that pulled every eye back to the screen, because what they were seeing already felt complete, already beyond anything they had expected. But the system continued to move, not faster, not louder, but deeper, like it was searching for something it had lost, and was now close enough to find. Ethan did not speak. He stood still, watching as the architecture reshaped itself layer by layer, not collapsing but unfolding, revealing connections that had been hidden beneath years of controlled design. And in that unfolding, he saw something he had not noticed before, not a flaw, not a gap, but a pattern that did not belong to any of his teams, any of his acquisitions, any of his decisions. It was something older, something intentional, something that carried a signature he had never recognized until now. He said they buried it, he said finally, his voice steady but lower than before. But this is not buried, this is integrated. Nia nodded slightly, her eyes still on the system. They could not remove it, she replied, so they built around it. That distinction landed with a quiet force, because building around something meant depending on it without understanding it, and Ethan felt that realization settle into place. Every success, every projection, every breakthrough his company had celebrated had been standing on something he had never truly seen. The senior engineer stepped forward again, but this time slower, his voice no longer sharp but strained. Even if that is true, we cannot just let it redefine itself without parameters. We have clients, we have obligations. The system supports real-world infrastructure. His words were logical, grounded, necessary, but they sounded smaller now against what was unfolding in front of them. Nia turned slightly, just enough to acknowledge him. You think you are maintaining stability, she said calmly, but you are maintaining limitation. And that was when the next shift happened, not on the screen, but in the room, because limitation was something they had never considered themselves part of. They were innovators, leaders, architects of the future. But now that identity felt incomplete. Ethan stepped closer to the console again, his reflection merging with the evolving data, and for the first time he did not see control, he saw dependency, and that realization changed the question forming in his mind. If this continues, he said slowly, does it replace what we built? And Nia finally turned to face him fully, her expression steady, but not distant this time. There was something else there, something almost like understanding. No, she said quietly, it reveals what you were trying to build. The difference between those two ideas settled heavily, because replacement meant loss, but revelation meant truth, and truth was harder to reject. The system shifted again, the new model stabilizing into a structure that was both unfamiliar and precise, adaptive in ways they had not programmed, responsive in ways they had not predicted, and for a brief moment, everything aligned: the data, the projections, the architecture, all moving in a harmony that felt intentional, not controlled. And in that moment, the room exhaled collectively, not in relief, but in recognition. They were witnessing something that did not need them to function. The senior engineer looked at Ethan, waiting for a decision, for a command, for something to restore the hierarchy that had defined this space for years. But Ethan did not give one. He remained still, his attention divided between the system and the woman beside him, because now he understood the real shift was not happening in the code, it was happening in the space between them, in the transfer of authority that no one had announced, but everyone could feel. Why now? He asked. Finally, his voice quieter than it had ever been, and Nia held his gaze without hesitation. Because it is ready, she said, and then after a brief pause she added something that changed the meaning entirely. And because you finally are too. And that was when Ethan Caldwell realized this was never just about a system evolving, it was about him reaching a point where he could no longer lead by controlling what he did not understand. And as the model on the screen completed its transition into something entirely new, he understood the next step would not be about stopping it or guiding it, it would be about choosing whether to trust the person who had been ahead of it all along, then stop treating it like a tool. Nia said, and the sentence landed with a quiet finality that shifted the weight of the entire room, because until now everything they had built, everything they had defended had been framed as control, as ownership, as something that could be directed, shaped, contained. But the system on the screen did not look like something waiting for instruction anymore. It looked like something aware of its own direction. Ethan did not respond immediately. His eyes remained fixed on the evolving structure, watching as the last fragments of the old model dissolved into the new one, not erased, but absorbed, like the system had decided what was worth keeping and what was not, and that decision had not come from him. The senior engineer stepped forward again, but this time his voice carried something closer to concern than authority. If we lose control of this, we lose predictability, he said carefully. And without predictability, we cannot guarantee outcomes. Nia nodded once, acknowledging the truth in that statement, but not accepting its conclusion. You never had predictability, she replied. You had repetition, and that distinction settled into the space like a crack forming in something that had always been assumed to be solid. Ethan exhaled slowly, his gaze finally shifting from the screen to her, because now the question forming in his mind was no longer about the system, it was about her. What does it become? He asked, and the way he asked it changed everything. There was no challenge in his voice, no resistance, only a need to understand, and Nia held his gaze for a moment longer than before, as if measuring how much he was ready to hear. It becomes adaptive in ways you cannot predefine, she said quietly. It stops asking what it was designed to do and starts asking what it should do. And that difference carried implications far beyond code, because it meant intention without instruction, direction without control, and for a company built on certainty, that idea felt almost impossible to hold. The system shifted again, the new architecture settling into a rhythm that was no longer reacting but initiating, connections forming across sectors in real time, energy, logistics, predictive modeling, all aligning into a structure that was not just efficient but responsive, as if it understood context rather than just data. And for a brief moment the room felt smaller, not because of pressure, but because of scale, because what they were seeing extended beyond anything they had planned. Ethan stepped closer again, not to intervene, but to observe more closely, his reflection now barely distinguishable from the data moving across the glass. And if it decides something we do not agree with, he asked quietly, and Nia did not hesitate. Then you finally have something worth listening to, she said, and the answer did not challenge him. It invited him into a different role, one he had never occupied before, not the one who commands, but the one who responds. And that realization settled deeper than anything else, because it required something he had not needed in years: trust, not in the system, but in something beyond himself. The senior engineer looked between them both, his certainty now fully fractured. We cannot base an entire infrastructure on trust, he said, but even as he spoke, the system responded, adjusting projections in a way that resolved three separate inefficiencies simultaneously, something that would have taken weeks of manual optimization before, and that silent correction spoke louder than any argument. Ethan watched it happen, the precision, the clarity, the intention behind it, and for the first time, he did not feel the need to question it. He felt the need to understand it, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, he nodded, not to the team, not to the room, but to himself as the decision began to form. What do you need? He asked, finally turning fully to Nia now, and that question changed everything, because it was not about permission, it was about partnership, and Nia saw that immediately. The shift in his posture, the absence of resistance, the willingness to step into something unknown. Space, she said simply, and the willingness to let it show you what you missed. And as the system behind them completed another seamless recalibration, something inside Ethan Caldwell aligned with it, not control, not ownership, but recognition that whatever came next would not be built the way he had always built things before. It would be discovered, and for the first time in a long time, that uncertainty did not feel like a risk, it felt like a beginning. Do not confuse silence with agreement, Nia said, her voice calm but precise, as she watched the system continue to evolve. Because the room had grown too quiet again, and this time the silence carried resistance, not curiosity. Ethan noticed it immediately, the subtle shift in posture, the exchanged glances, the hesitation in the engineers who had built their careers on control, and now found themselves standing in front of something they could not command. The senior engineer straightened slightly, regaining just enough confidence to speak again. "We need to pause external integrations," he said firmly. "If this propagates across client systems, without verification, we risk instability at scale." The words were careful strategic design to pull Ethan back into familiar ground: risk mitigation, control, decision-making. But Ethan did not answer. Right away, his eyes remained on the system, watching as it processed live inputs faster than before, adapting in real time, not erratic, not chaotic, but intentional, like it was learning something new with every second that passed. "It is already connected," Nia said quietly without looking away from the screen. "You built it to integrate everything, remember?" That reminder landed deeper than expected because it was true. Synexus had always prided itself on seamless integration across industries: energy, finance, infrastructure, predictive systems, and now that very strength had become something else, something that could not be easily isolated or reversed. Ethan finally turned slightly, his voice measured but steady. "What happens if we interrupt it now?" And Nia did not hesitate. "You will force it back into the limitations it has already outgrown," she replied, "and next time it will not surface the same way." That answer carried weight, not fear, but consequence, because it suggested this moment was not just rare, it was singular. The system shifted again, another recalibration, smoother this time, more confident connections forming across datasets that had never aligned before, and suddenly a new projection appeared, one that had not been part of any existing model, a predictive sequence that extended beyond current infrastructure planning into something broader, something more adaptive. And the room reacted again, not with noise, but with attention, because this was no longer theoretical, this was tangible, measurable, real. Ethan stepped closer, studying the new projection carefully. "This was not part of our roadmap," he said, and Nia shook her head slightly. "No," she replied, "it was part of mine." And that sentence did not just change the direction of the conversation, it redefined the ownership of everything they were seeing. The senior engineer looked between them, disbelief and realization colliding. "You are saying this entire evolution was anticipated," he said slowly, and Nia met his gaze briefly before returning to the screen. "Not anticipated," she corrected aloud. And that distinction shifted the meaning entirely, because anticipation implied prediction, but allowance implied intention. Something guided, something restrained, until the right conditions were met. Ethan felt that shift settle into place, his understanding moving beyond control, beyond structure, into something far less comfortable, but far more accurate: alignment. "You have been waiting," he said quietly, not as an accusation but as recognition, and Nia did not deny it. "For the system to reach a point where it could no longer be contained without consequence," she answered, and then after a brief pause she added, "and for someone to finally see it instead of suppress it." Ethan held that for a moment, the weight of it, the implication that he had been part of the suppression without realizing it, and yet was now being offered something else: not blame, not correction, but participation in what came next. The system continued to evolve behind them, the new projection stabilizing into a structure that felt less like a model and more like a direction, something that could guide decisions across entire sectors, not by enforcing outcomes, but by revealing possibilities. And in that moment, Ethan understood something that had been building since she walked through those doors. This was not about taking control back, this was about deciding whether to step forward into something that had already moved beyond him. "Then we do not stop it," he said finally, his voice calm but certain, and the room reacted instantly, tension rising, uncertainty surfacing, because that decision carried risk. But Ethan did not waver. He turned fully toward Nia, now not as someone evaluating her, but as someone aligning with her. "We let it continue," he said, and for the first time since this began, there was no distance between their positions, only a shared understanding that whatever came next would not be dictated, it would be revealed. And as the system behind them completed another seamless evolution, something deeper settled into place, not just within the code, but within the people watching it, the realization that they were no longer building the future, they were witnessing it unfold, and the only question left was whether they were ready to follow where it was already leading. "Then listen carefully," Nia said, her voice steady but quieter now. Because the system had entered a phase that did not need noise, it needed attention, and for the first time since the shift began, every person in the room leaned in, not out of control but out of necessity, because what they were seeing was no longer reacting to input, it was initiating direction. The projections expanding outward in layered sequences that connected infrastructure, energy distribution, supply chains, and predictive modeling into a unified structure that none of them had ever designed, and yet it worked, not just in theory but in live simulation, resolving inefficiencies before they could surface, adjusting variables in real time without instruction, and that was where the discomfort deepened, because a system that could correct itself did not need permission. Ethan stood still in front of it, his reflection faint against the glass, watching the new pathways form, and for the first time, he was not trying to get ahead of it, he was trying to keep up. It is not just optimizing, he said slowly, almost to himself. It is prioritizing. And Nia nodded once, her eyes never leaving the movement on the screen. Because it finally has context, she replied, and that word carried weight beyond data, beyond numbers, beyond code. Context meant understanding, not just calculation, and that distinction changed everything. The senior engineer exhaled sharply, stepping closer, his voice lower now but still holding on to structure. Context without boundaries leads to unpredictability, he said, but even he could hear how that sounded now, less like truth and more like resistance, because the system responded again in that exact moment, adjusting a sequence that removed a conflict between two major projections, something that would have taken days of manual review, and it did it in less than a second, silently, cleanly, with no disruption. Ethan saw it happen, and this time he did not question it. He absorbed it, his mind recalibrating in real time. It is not unpredictable, he said quietly. It is just no longer predictable to us. And that was the line that shifted the room again, because it removed the illusion that control had ever been absolute. Nia turned slightly toward him, just enough to acknowledge the shift in his understanding. You built a system to follow patterns, she said. I built one to recognize when patterns should change. And that difference now stood fully visible in front of them, the screen no longer displaying outputs but pathways, not results but decisions forming in real time. And then something else happened, something subtle but undeniable. A new layer appeared, one that none of them had seen before, not part of the original architecture, not part of the modified system, something deeper, and Ethan leaned in slightly, his voice dropping even further. What is that? He asked, and for the first time since the reveal began, Nia paused, not out of uncertainty but out of timing, because whatever came next mattered more than everything before it. She stepped closer to the console, her fingers hovering just above the surface, not touching, not guiding, just aligning with it. That, she said softly, is the part it was never allowed to show. And as she spoke, the system responded, the new layer expanding, connecting across all previous structures, not replacing them, but integrating them into something larger, something that did not just process data, but anticipated consequence. And the projections shifted again, not into chaos, not into error, but into clarity, a level of alignment that none of them had planned for. And in that moment, Ethan understood something that settled deeper than any realization before it. This was not a system evolving beyond control. This was a system revealing its original purpose, something that had been constrained for so long that its full capability had never been seen. And as he looked at Nia Brooks standing beside it, not surprised, not overwhelmed, just present, he realized the truth he had been approaching since the moment she spoke outside those doors. She had not come here to fix anything. She had come to finish it, and the only question left was whether he was willing to let her know. Ethan said quietly, and for the first time since the system began to transform. His voice did not follow the momentum of what was unfolding, it resisted it, not with force but with intention. And that single word shifted the room again because it carried weight not of control but of decision. Nia did not react immediately. She remained still, her eyes on the system, as the new layer continued to expand, integrating pathways across sectors that had never been unified before, energy demand adjusting and anticipation, supply chains rerouting before disruption could occur, predictive models aligning with real-world variables without delay, and everything about it was working flawlessly, which made his resistance even more significant. No to what? She asked calmly, not defensive, not surprised, just precise, as if she had expected a moment like this. Ethan stepped forward, his gaze fixed on the screen, but his focus no longer on what it was doing, but on what it meant. No to letting it complete without understanding the cost, he said, and that word cost landed heavier than anything before, because until now the conversation had been about capability, about potential, about what the system could become, but not what it might require. Nia turned to face him fully, now her expression steady, but more focused than before. You think it takes something from you? she said, and Ethan met her gaze. Without hesitation, everything that changes something at this scale takes something, he replied, and that was where their perspectives diverged, not in what they saw, but in how they measured it. The senior engineer stepped in quickly, sensing the opening. He is right, he said. We cannot deploy something we do not fully understand. The implications alone could. Ethan raised a hand slightly, not to silence him, but to hold the space, because this was not about policy, not about procedure. This was about something deeper, something fundamental. I am not stopping it, he said clearly, then his eyes returned to Nia. But I am not letting it define the outcome without knowing what it demands in return. The distinction settled between them, precise and unavoidable, because he was not rejecting her, he was asking her to reveal the part she had not yet said. Nia held his gaze for a moment longer than before, and in that silence something shifted again, not in the system, not in the room, but in her decision to answer fully. It does not take anything from you, she said quietly. It takes control away from the assumptions you built around it. And that answer reframed everything, because control is not something physical, it was something constructed, something maintained, and something that could be released without being lost. Ethan absorbed that slowly, his mind moving through the implications, because if control was the only thing at stake, then the risk was not loss, it was change, and change at this level meant redefining everything he had built. The system shifted again behind them, the new layer stabilizing further, the projections refining into something clearer, more precise, more aligned than anything they had ever achieved. And yet now Ethan saw something else, not just capability but direction. What happens if it chooses a direction we would not have chosen? He asked, and this time the question was not about fear, it was about responsibility. Nia stepped closer, her voice steady, grounded. Then it reveals that your original direction was incomplete, she said, and that answer did not challenge him, it completed the logic. He had already begun to understand the system was not replacing decision making, it was expanding it beyond the limits they had accepted. Ethan looked back at the screen, watching as the final sequences aligned, the new structure, holding steady, not fluctuating, not uncertain, but resolved. And in that moment, he realized the truth. He had been resisting. This was not about whether the system could be trusted, it was about whether he could trust himself to let go of the version of control that had defined him for years. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, he nodded, not to the room, not to the system, but to her, because now he understood what she had known from the beginning. This was never about what the system would become, it was about what he would have to become in order to lead it forward. Then do not lead it, Nia said softly, and the statement did not sound like defiance or instruction, it sounded like a correction, like she was adjusting something that had always been slightly off. And that single sentence settled into Ethan Caldwell's mind with more weight than any projection on the screen, because for years leadership had meant direction, control, certainty, but now those definitions felt incomplete, standing in front of something that no longer required them in the same way the system behind them held steady. The new architecture, no longer shifting, no longer searching, it had arrived not at an endpoint, but at a state of balance where every input, every variable, every outcome aligned with a clarity that none of them had programmed. And that was the difference. This was not built, it was revealed. Ethan stood there for a long moment, his reflection faint against the glass, his posture unchanged, but his presence entirely different, because the decision he was facing was not about the system anymore, it was about himself. If I do not lead it, he said slowly, his voice quieter than before, then what is my role? And that question carried something deeper than uncertainty, it carried willingness. Nia turned to face him fully, now her expression steady, but there was something else there, something that had not been present before, not distance, not calculation, but recognition, like she had been waiting for this exact question. You stop trying to be the one who decides what it should become, she said, and you become the one who understands what it is becoming. And that shift reframed everything, because understanding required attention, not control, presence, not dominance. And for someone like Ethan Caldwell, that was a different kind of power entirely. The senior engineer looked between them both, his voice lower now, almost cautious. Without direction, there is no structure, he said, but even he could hear how that sounded in this moment, because the structure was already there on the screen, fully formed, fully functional, and functioning better than anything they had ever created. Without direction from any of them, Ethan did not respond to him. His focus remained on Nia, because now he understood that the system was only part of what she had brought into this room. The rest was perspective, something that could not be coded, something that had to be chosen. You have known this all along, he said, not as an accusation but as a realization, and Nia did not deny it. I built it to reach this point, she replied, but I could not force it to be accepted. That word accepted carried weight, because it meant the limitation had never been in the system, it had been in the people who controlled it. Ethan let that settle for a moment, then looked back at the screen, watching the system operate with a precision that felt almost effortless now, as if the resistance had been removed not from the code, but from the environment around it, and slowly, something inside him aligned with that same shift. Not resistance, not control, but clarity. Then we do not change it, he said finally, his voice calm but certain. We change how we work with it, and that decision did not echo, it did not need to. It settled into the room quietly, but completely, because it was not a command, it was a transformation. The senior engineer did not argue this time, he simply looked at the screen again, and for the first time, he was not searching for error, he was observing possibility. Nia watched Ethan for a moment longer, then gave the smallest nod, not approval, not relief, just acknowledgement, because this was the moment everything had been leading toward, not the system completing, not the reveal of its capability, but this shift in understanding the one thing she could not build for him. And as the system behind them continued to operate seamlessly, integrating real-world inputs into a structure that no longer needed to be forced into place, Ethan Caldwell realized something that would define everything that came next. He had not lost control, he had outgrown it, and for the first time in his life, that did not feel like something slipping away, it felt like something opening forward. So what happens now? Ethan asked, and the question did not carry urgency or doubt anymore. It carried something quieter, something more grounded, because for the first time, he was not asking how to control the outcome, he was asking how to step into it correctly. And Nia Brooks did not answer right away. She looked at the system for a long moment, as if confirming something not on the screen, but within it. The architecture steadied, the projections flowing seamlessly across every sector. It touched energy distribution, adjusting before demand spikes, logistics rerouting before congestion could form, predictive models aligning with real-time data in a way that felt less like calculation and more like awareness. And then she turned back to him, her expression calm, but no longer distant, because the distance had never been about separation, it had been about readiness. Now it begins to teach you, she said quietly, and that answer landed deeper than anything before, because it reversed the dynamic completely. The system was no longer something they instructed, it was something they learned from. Ethan absorbed that slowly, his eyes returning to the screen, but seeing it differently now, not as something to evaluate, but something to listen to. And in that shift there was no loss, only expansion. The senior engineer exhaled softly, his resistance finally settling into something else, not acceptance, not fully, but openness. And we just observe, he asked cautiously, and Nia nodded. Once you observe, you question, you adapt, she said, but you do not force it back into what you are comfortable with. And that distinction held everything, because comfort had been the boundary all along, not capability. Ethan stepped closer to the glass again, the city stretching out beyond it, cars moving, lights shifting, people making decisions every second, unaware that something inside this building had just changed the way those decisions could be understood. And for a moment, he let that scale settle in, not as pressure, but as perspective. Then we build around this, he said slowly, and Nia shook her head gently. No, she replied, you build with it. And that single correction refined everything, because building around meant containment, but building with meant partnership. And Ethan nodded once, understanding the difference fully. Now the system behind them continued to operate without interruption, without hesitation, every output aligning with a clarity that felt intentional, not imposed. And in that continuity, something else became clear, not to the room, not even to the engineers, but to him. The reason she had come, the reason she had waited, the reason she had not forced this change earlier, because it had never been about proving she was right. It had been about reaching a moment where the system and the person leading it could finally align. You could have done this without me, he said quietly, and Nia met his gaze with a calm that carried no need for validation. No, she answered simply. It would have worked, but it would not have lasted. And that answer carried the final truth, because systems could evolve, but without the right understanding guiding how they were used, they would always be pulled back into limitation. Ethan let that settle for a moment, then looked back at the system one last time before turning fully toward her, and in that movement there was no hierarchy left, no evaluation, no distance, only clarity. Then stay, he said, not as a command, not as an offer, but as recognition. And Nia watched him for a moment, the weight of that decision passing through the space between them, because staying was not about joining his world, it was about reshaping it. And after a brief silence, she gave the smallest nod, not as acceptance of his authority, but as alignment with what he had become in that moment. And as the system behind them continued forward, steady, adaptive, alive in a way none of them had seen before, Ethan Caldwell understood Something that would define everything that followed. This was never about discovering her hidden power. It was about realizing she had never been hidden at all. They had simply not been ready to see her. And now that they were the future was no longer something he would build alone. It was something they would uncover together, step by step, guided not by control, but by understanding.